Hi. So in this video, we're going to talk about Eugene Ionesco's play Macbeth, which is, as you might guess, an adaptation of Shakespeare's Macbeth, filtered through Ionesco's theater of the absurd lens. The storyline of Macbeth is roughly similar to Macbeth, but we get a number of characters who either aren't really in Macbeth or aren't in Macbeth at all. Like we get a lemonade seller, for instance, who comes on and tries to sell lemonade, promising that it will sort of cure all of these different things. It's a sort of patent medicine type scam. Like any sort of wounds that soldiers have sustained in the battle, for instance, the lemonade seller promises it will cure. We don't get that. Maybe you could make a case that there's some sort of link with the guard in Macbeth, who talks about drinking alcohol a lot and the benefits of drinking alcohol. But if there's that link, and that's not necessarily a bad argument, but it's a very tenuous link. But we open with Glamis and Candor, two nobles under the regime of Duncan. They are displeased with the way that Duncan runs things, largely because he taxes them so much. He requires that they give him 10,000 chickens a year and their eggs. He takes their men to serve in his army. He takes their money. He takes their chickens, sheep, pigs, swine, bread, horses, recruits, 1,000 youngest girls, or 1,000 young girls, etc., etc. So we've got all of these things that Duncan is taking from the nobles, which have turned Glamis and Candor against him. Now, what's interesting, this is a kind of typical medieval noble's complaint against a monarch. We get this bit. Glamis says, "We want freedom." Candor says, "The right to make more and more money, self-rule." Glamis says, "Liberty." Candor says, "Running our own affairs." Glamis says, "And his." Candor says, "And his." That's "and Duncan's," by the way. This is, again, fairly typical of, we think about, so, for instance, Magna Carta in British history is the great document that theoretically enshrines freedom. The basis of Magna Carta, of course, is that King John was taking a bunch of stuff from the nobles, and the nobles wanted to ensure that they had the right to take stuff from the peasants. So this is this kind of thing. And, we think about something like Mel Gibson's Braveheart, right? The idea of, we want a nation for Scotland, for Scottish people. No, really, it would be we want a Scottish monarchy. It's not we want freedom in this sort of liberal tradition that we get from people like Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, people like this. Even their version of liberty is extremely curtailed, but this is not we want people to be free. This is we want us, the nobility who's not the king, to have the right to exploit the peasants and stuff. And so Ionesco gives us that very directly. It is that kind of critique of power and the way in which power is often self-serving, even when it utilizes the rhetoric of liberty, freedom, free choice, etc., etc. And we get this toward the end of the bit where Glamis and Candor are talking, because Glamis describes Duncan as a tyrant, a usurper, a despot, a dictator, a miscreant, an ogre, an ass, a goose, and worse. The proof is he's in power. If I didn't believe it, why should I want to depose him? My motives are thoroughly honorable. And of course, the irony here, so this idea that we know that Duncan is terrible because he's in power. So that in itself is sufficient evidence for Glamis and Candor that that Duncan is a terrible ruler. Now the irony, of course, is that they want to jointly share his throne. So they want to take over that authority that Duncan currently has. The first portion of the play, the first maybe third or so, is devoted to the battle between Glamis and Candor on the one side and Duncan being fought, Duncan's forces being led by Macbeth and Bankos. Duncan himself is fairly cowardly. He is unwilling to actually participate in the battle. He is distrustful of his generals. He is terrified that even though the reports he's getting from his generals are that they are on the verge of victory, Duncan is terrified that he will lose, so he tells his servants to have his fastest horse saddled and ready to take him to a ship in case he loses, etc., etc. Then we get this really interesting bit. Candor is captured, and he gives this speech just before he's going to be executed, where he says, "If I'd been stronger, I'd have been your anointed king. Defeated, I'm a traitor and a coward. If only I'd won. But history was against me." That's history with a capital H in this case. History is right, objectively speaking. I'm just a historical dead end. I hope at least that my fate will serve as an example to you all and to posterity. Throw in your lot with the stronger. But how do you know who the stronger is before it comes to the crunch? The masses should keep out of it until the fighting is over and then throw in their lot with the winner. The logic of events is the only one that counts. Historical reason is the only reason. There are no transcendental values to set against it. I am guilty, but our rebellion was necessary, if only to prove that I'm a criminal. I shall die happy. My life is an empty husk. My body and those of my followers will fertilize the fields and push up wheat for future harvests. I'm a perfect example of what not to do. So this is really an interesting speech because it brings together these elements of almost a Marxist dialectical materialism. That is, the idea that history progresses according to its own inexorable logic. Social systems move forward on the basis of what is inevitably going to happen. That's a very simplified version of dialectical materialism, but the gist is there. Along with this idea that there are no transcendental values to set against the logic of history. This is sort of the existentialist or absurdist element that informs so much of Ionesco's work. And this idea that values in the abstract, values are not objective. They're not objective. They don't exist in and of themselves. They exist only in contingent situations, and they exist only in the forms dictated by those particular situations. So we get that element of it. As we move on, we get the witches, the famous witch scene from Shakespeare's Macbeth, in which the witches prophesy that Macbeth will sit on the throne, and he can't be killed by any man of woman born. He won't be defeated until the forest of Dunsinane comes to the castle to attack him, etc., etc. We get a version of the prophecy in which Banquo in Shakespeare, or Banco in Macbeth, in Macbeth, sorry, is promised that his descendants will sit on the throne and be a great dynasty, etc., etc. The witches actually, though, play a much more direct role in Macbeth than they do in Macbeth, because at some point around the middle of the play, it's revealed that one of the witches is Lady Duncan, and the other is her handmaid. And they are the witches who have made these prophecies. Lady Duncan schemes with Macbeth and Banko to overthrow Duncan for several grievances, mostly because Duncan is kind of a dick. But they overthrow them, and Lady Duncan marries Macbeth, who now takes over the throne. He then has to kill Banko because Banko realizes that Macbeth has gotten all of the rewards from this, and even though Macbeth promised to make him chief counselor or something like that, in fact, there's nothing to hold him to that promise. And so, Macbeth kills Banko. Things go on roughly the way they do in Macbeth. Lady Duncan becomes Lady Macbeth, but then the witches change back into being witches, and they leave. So Lady Macbeth disappears, interestingly enough. Which is actually kind of striking, because in Macbeth, Lady Macbeth disappears from the play. Like, it's announced that she committed suicide, but she just sort of drops out. But then what gets really interesting is toward the end, because we have this normally we have a character listed by a single name, right? But here we have Lady Macbeth or Lady Duncan listed as entering. And she says, beloved or not, so the fourth they're all sort of hailing her as she comes in, thinking that she's Lady Macbeth. The fourth guest at the party where Macbeth sees the ghost of Banquo says, Lady Macbeth, our beloved sovereign. Lady Macbeth or Lady Duncan says, beloved or not, I am your sovereign, but I'm not Lady Macbeth. I'm Lady Duncan, the unhappy but faithful widow of your rightful king, the Archduke Duncan. Basically, what we learn is that the witches imprisoned Lady Duncan and her handmaid in the prison, took on Lady Duncan's shape to convince Macbeth and Banko to kill Duncan and usurp the throne. Then they pieced out and they let Lady Duncan out of the prison, so she came back, basically to sort of lead the counter revolution, if you will, to lead the movement to overthrow Macbeth, led primarily by her son Macul. We go through so in Shakespeare, the way they get around the Macbeth can't be killed by anyone of woman born thing is that Macduff was born via C-section, right? And it's a roundabout way to get there, but it sort of works. In Macbeth, Ionesco really just goes for it with this one. So Macbeth says, no man of woman born can harm Macbeth. Macul says, they've pulled the wool over your eyes. They were putting you on. Then Lady Duncan to Macbeth says, Macul isn't my son. Duncan adopted him. Banko was his father. His mother was a gazelle that a witch transformed into a woman. After bringing Macul into the world, she changed back into a gazelle again. I left the court secretly before he was born so that no one would know that I wasn't pregnant. Everyone took him for my son and Duncan's. He wanted an heir, you see. So this gets us to the Bankos heirs will sit on the throne and be a great dynasty, etc., etc. It gets us around the of no woman born issue. But really, his mother was a gazelle that a witch transformed into a woman. I mean, Shakespeare's thing is a bit iffy in terms of, does that really make any sense? Ionesco has just abandoned the question of does it make any sense. But again, it's theater of the absurd, so, whatever. It is what it is. And then the last bit actually is really a striking ending, because at the end of Shakespeare's Macbeth, right, we have the return of the proper dynasty. We have Macbeth, the usurper, overthrown, but it's worth noting that at the end of that play, Macduff and I forget what the name. Seward, I think, is the English general who sort of comes up. I forget what the name of the person who takes the throne is at the end of Macbeth. It's been 7 years since I read it, I think. But it's striking that at the end of Macbeth, the visual symbolism and the setup is actually very similar to the way in which Macbeth took power. A violent act to overthrow the previous ruler and install himself. At the end of that play, we have the same thing occurring to reestablish the proper dynastic succession. Ionesco picks up on this because at the end, McCool makes this very long speech. It's like a two full page long speech. Basically, he's talking about how brutal and authoritarian and ruthless and selfish and violent he is going to be as a ruler. So, like, the idea that, because the thing is, other than murdering Banko, Macbeth doesn't seem to have done that much wrong in this play. Duncan was not an especially good ruler. We don't get much of a sense of how good a ruler Macbeth is, but we also don't get a sense that he's doing much wrong as a ruler. Then McCool is put on the table, or he's put on the throne. And all of the people, we have 4 people in the sort of chorus here who are singing McCool's praises and condemning Macbeth as a violent, destructive tyrant and usurper. And basically McCool's like, shut up, I'm going to be the most horrible ruler you've ever seen. And you can't do anything about it because I'm the legitimate king. I am going to be brutal, I'm going to be cruel, I'm going to be arbitrary, I am going to do all of these terrible things, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. And so the play ends on that note. And it is this sort of great reminder, really, in a way, of the absurdity of the notion that at the end of Macbeth, order and truth, generous rule, benevolent rule, whatever it is somehow restored.